One of the key things to avoid in all cases when playing small ball is falling into predictable patterns based on your bet sizes. For example, you don't want your bluffs to be 60% of the pot and your value bets to always be 80% of the pot. In theory, that would work out extremely well if no one paid attention, but the fact is, if you fall into these patterns, your more perceptive opponents will pick up on it and they're going to exploit you. They'll re-raise bluff your smaller bets, and they're going to lay down strong hands against your bigger bets. So the best way to value bet the river with hands you want to get paid off is to bet an amount that you'd bet if you were also bluffing. So essentially, your bluff bet and your value bet size should be close to identical. I've actually seen some young players apply a version of small ball, only they make it ridiculously obvious when they had a strong hand and were looking for extra value, purely based on their bet sizes. For example, our hero raised from late position to 250 with blinds of 50 and 100. The blind called and the flop came 10-10-8. The big blind checked and our hero bet 350. The big blind called. The turn was a 6, and again, the big blind checked. This time, hero bets 900 and the blind called again. The river came the deuce of clubs, and with 3,050 in the pot, our hero went a little nuts and bet 6,500. Okay, now earlier in the session, I noticed that the kid got caught bluffing twice. Only on those occasions, his bets were 50 to 60% of the pot size. Considering the fact that I knew he was trying to play small pots, he made it too obvious that he had a monster hand. The big blind showed pocket aces and mucked them face up. Now, I'm certain, absolutely certain, that if the kid would have bet 1,700 to 2,200, the big blind would have called him instantly. The kid overpriced the hand drastically, and it cost him an extra 2,000 or so. I've used a blackjack analogy once before in regards to small ball, and I'm going to go back to blackjack one more time to help illustrate my point here. I'm assuming most of you have heard of card counting in blackjack, and that when done properly, it can give the player an advantage over the house. Essentially, it works like this. When the remaining deck is rich with high cards, that's good for the player. When the remaining deck is mostly small cards, that's going to help the house. So what card counters are notorious for doing is varying their bet size based on the count of the remaining cards in the deck. So when the deck is pro-player, they increase their bets, and when the deck is pro-house, they lower their bets. Most every card counter in the world gets caught, but many of them get caught quickly because they're too greedy. Similar to our example when the kid tried to make a big payday, he had a full house that hand, a bad card counter will alert the house if he makes drastic changes to his bet size. Imagine you're a pit boss in a casino, and you have a player betting $10 a hand at the start of the shoe. Then after about 6 hands or so, his bet goes to 500 for the rest of the shoe. You think he might be counting cards or something, or just a wild man? The key is to make subtle changes to your bet sizes so that it goes unnoticed. So rather than go from $10 to 500, maybe instead you just play 2 spots at 10 each for the remainder of the shoe. After win, maybe you go to $15 on each spot, whatever it is. You don't vary your bet size so drastically that your cover's blown. Like the hero in our poker example, who got greedy by overbetting the pot. In a tournament, the small ball approach is one where you want to avoid big pots at all costs unless you have the nuts. By default, when you get to the river, pots will be bigger anyway, which puts you in dangerous territory. In fact, ideally, when small ball works best, most hands don't even get to the river. But when they do, there's just a small bet by one player and maybe a call. That's usually how it goes. The value in this approach to the game isn't to make large value bets in dangerous situations, but instead to nickel and dime your opponents in the marginal situations, and on the rare occasions when you actually have the nuts, well, then you hope to hook them for a bigger bet along the way. However, when you do have the nuts, or what you feel is clearly the best hand, you shouldn't veer from the small ball betting pattern that you've used throughout the tournament. In fact, you shouldn't bet more than what's in the pot pretty much ever. There are some very rare cases where you'd want to do that, but for the most part, your value bet shouldn't exceed the pot size. The key to figuring out the correct value bet size is figuring out the strength of your opponent's hand. Okay? The stronger you feel your opponent's hand is, the more you should bet. Conversely, if you think your opponent has close to nothing, well, then you want to make it easy for him to find a way to justify making a bad call. In extreme cases, you might even want to bet the absolute minimum, even if it only represents like 10% of the pot. I've done this before, and it works, especially against math guys. In a tournament, your bet sizes, when value betting, should also take into account the amount of pressure your bet will be putting on your opponent. Okay? So, for example, if making a pot-sized bet would put your opponent all in, that might scare him away from calling a bet since he desperately wants to stay in the tournament. So in a case like that, instead of betting the whole pot, or 100% of his chips and putting his tournament life on the line, instead, you might want to bet maybe 75% of his chips. So that way, he may think, well, I might have the best hand here, but even if I'm wrong, I still have some chips left to play with. Let's take a look at 3 separate examples and then try to figure out what size value bet makes the most sense. Okay, with the blinds at 1 and 200, a player from first position makes it 600 to go, and you re-raise him from late position to 2100 with aces. He calls. The flop comes deuce, deuce, 6. Your opponent checks, you bet 2500, he calls again. The turn is the 8 of hearts, and again, your opponent checks. You bet 4000, he calls. The river brings the deuce of clubs. Your opponent checks on the river. Okay? Both you and your opponent have 16,000 in chips remaining, and there's 17,500 in the pot. How much should you bet? 4,000, 10,000, or all in? Well, if you said 4,000, that's incorrect. Okay? It should be clear in this situation, all right, that your opponent has a strong hand and has shown that he's willing to pay off decent-sized bets. The way the hand is played out, it looks like your opponent has to have a decent-sized pocket pair. So 4,000 is just not enough value for your hand. You should be able to get more in that spot. Now, I'm not going to say all in is a terrible play in this spot, but it's still probably not the best option. Okay? It's not a horrible play, but let's consider what likely hands our opponent has here. Okay? He probably doesn't have pocket kings, as you may have heard from him sooner in the hand. So his most likely hands are in the range of maybe pocket nines through pocket queens. This would be a very risky call for his tournament life, and the fact that you've forced him to make that decision could convince him that he's beat. Okay? That's not the result you want. And if he folds, your bet sizing arrow could have cost you a decent value bet on the river in that spot. Very good. This is a powerful bet, big bet, that you're more likely to get called on rather than an all-in. Okay? A bet of 10,000 represents a good percentage of the pot size, and it's not so big that it's going to apply maximum pressure on your opponent, which will increase the likelihood of him paying you off, which is exactly what you want with aces there. Okay, now, with blinds at 50 and 100, you raise from the button with ace-8 suited, and the big blind calls you. The flop comes king-8-4, you both check the flop. The turn is the 5 of spades. Your opponent checks, and you bet 400. The river, the king of hearts. Both you and your opponent have well over 10,000 in chips, and there's 1,350 in the pot. How much should you bet? Should you bet 1,350, 550, or 1,000? Well, if you said 1,350, you're just a little bit too greedy in this spot, and it's probably going to cost you. Why bet so much when you yourself have a really marginal hand? If he's slow playing the king, you're just costing yourself more than you need to. And by betting the whole pot, you also decrease the chances that your opponent's going to make a loose call with bottom pair or even ace high. If you said 1,000, that's also a little bit too much. For the same reasons you shouldn't bet the whole pot in this situation, you shouldn't bet 1,000 either. If you're beat, your $1,000 bet will never, ever get your opponent to fold. All it will do is cost you more chips when he shows you pocket tens or king 3 or something like that. When making a thin value bet with a marginal hand, you don't want to waste that good read by allowing your opponent off the hook by overbetting it. You know your hand's likely the best hand, so make sure if you are going to make a value bet here that you get something for it. Excellent. 550 is a great bet. The way the hand played out, it doesn't look like either you or your opponent has a very strong hand. So any value bet here with second pair and the ace kicker should be considered a very thin value bet. There's no guarantee that your hand is the best hand, so by making a smallish bet, you accomplish 2 things. 1, you lose less when your opponent actually has you beat, and 2, you increase the likelihood of your opponent paying you off with a very weak hand like bottom pair or ace high. With blinds now at 400, 800, and a 100 ante, a player from early position makes it 2,400, and you call from the button with 7-8 of clubs. The flop comes king, 5, 6. Your opponent bets 3,000, you decide to call. The turn, the ace of hearts, and both of you check. The river is the 4 of clubs, giving you the nuts straight. Both you and your opponent have, let's say, over 50,000 left in chips, and there's about 12,900 in the pot. How much should you bet? Should you bet 12,900, the size of the pot, 8,500, or a $4,000 bet? No. You see, 12,900, the whole pot here, is just too much. If your opponent had a strong enough hand to call a pot-sized bet, what makes you think he would have checked on both the turn and the river? Your opponent likely checked because he doesn't like the ace or the king, and he has a hand like queens. If not that, maybe he has king-queen and just didn't like the ace. In either case, it doesn't look like ace-king, pocket aces, or pocket kings. So a pot-sized river bet just isn't going to get called at all. Now, in theory, 8,500 wouldn't seem bad, but it's still a little bit too much. Based on the way the hand played out, it should be obvious that your opponent isn't overly strong, as he would have been betting on the turn or river. A bet this big will usually convince him that his pair of queens or king-queen is no good, and you'll be letting him off the hook. 4,000 may seem like too small a bet, but it's absolutely correct in this situation. By making such a small bet in relation to the pot size, you'll be laying your opponent an excellent price to look you up and see if you were bluffing. Not to mention, if he has king-queen, he may believe that you're betting with a pair of kings with a worse kicker. The only significantly important factor in choosing this bet size is that if, in those rare cases, your opponent was trapping you with aces, kings, or ace-king, he likely won't be satisfied with earning your 4,000 river bet, and he might actually raise you to something like 12,000. At that point, you can re-raise again and hope he pays that off as well.